We are wrapping up the Beatitudes. Our goal is to study every verse on the Sermon on the Mount so that we will better know and live in the way of Jesus. And so we are now 9 sessions and 12 verses in by the end of today. So we're making good progress. The reason we want to do this is because His way is the way of wisdom, of truth, and of life. And we want to be like that wise man who built his house on the rock. We don't want to build our house anywhere else but on Jesus' wisdom. So as we've said many times before, and this slide will actually change next time we meet, believe it or not. But what Jesus is doing is inaugurating and constituting the community that is forming around Him. That's what the Sermon on the Mount is. His teaching is for everybody. So there's truth in there for every person. But it is aimed with special care at disciples, that is, people that intend to imitate Him. And we're going to see an aspect of that today that's rather sobering. And He begins, as God always does, by pronouncing blessing over His people. And that's what I hoped that you have really gotten as we've been studying the Beatitudes. Yes, welcome. As we've been studying the Beatitudes, I hope you've really gotten that we are in a spot of Jesus' teaching that is really about God's blessing for people before He gets into all the kind of moral exhortation, if you will. Last week we talked about the pure in heart peacemakers. We talked about purity as single-mindedness. Bishop Dan reminded us that purity could also be thought of as humility. We also heard a little bit from Martin Luther about how purity of heart has to do with filling your heart with the Word of God, with the truths of God. The reward or the blessing for the pure in heart was seeing God, knowing your Creator, knowing the truth in Jesus. We talked about being a peacemaker. We talked about peacemaking versus peacekeeping. And tried to suggest that peacemaking is much better, more biblical, and more what Jesus had in mind than simply keeping the peace. And the blessing there was sons of God. And so we talked about peacemaking as a communal, familial activity, something we do together as children of God, and that it also exemplifies the Christ-like character of people that are doing it. Okay, so that's our review, and now we're gonna get into our main section for today. Before we get there, let's pray this together and ask for the Lord's help. Bless the Lord who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning. Grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Savior Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Okay, we have 3 verses today. 3 verses. Matthew 5, 10, 11, and 12. So it's a good chunk of text. So we're just going to take 30 seconds to a minute here to read through this. I'm going to put it on the screen, and I want you guys to just read it to yourselves. I'll let it go through one more time. All right, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. A few things I want to point out right off the bat. Persecuted for righteousness' sake. This is the condition of blessing, okay? Persecuted for righteousness' sake. So let's talk about righteousness. We all know what persecuted means. Righteousness. We've talked about this before, a few weeks ago. Things as they should be according to God's character. Justice is a way of thinking of righteousness. Love is a way of thinking of righteousness. Behaving in a loving, faithful way. And so who are the people that are being persecuted here? Well, who are the people that are hungry and thirsting for righteousness? Remember how that was a bridge into the helping Beatitudes? We talked about the need Beatitudes. And then we talked about those that hunger and thirst for righteousness as a bridge to the helping Beatitudes. And so you have the merciful and the pure and the peacemakers are the ones that are working for righteousness. They're the ones being persecuted. That doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem right. But it's precisely the ones that are helping the needy, I think, the poor, the mourning, the meek, the hungry, the thirsty, that are in view here. These are the ones that are being persecuted because they are living into this call. So, why? It's not right, but why? Why does righteousness? And we're not talking about self-righteousness, okay? If you're persecuted for being self-righteous, we all know why, okay? You're a jerk. You deserve it, right? But if you're actually being righteous in the ways that we're talking about, why does that provoke persecution?
Is this rhetorical or?
No, this is real. This is a question. So yeah.
Well then, I think one reason is those who are righteous are the ones who help the needy, the ones who are poor and downtrodden, and helping them is not in line with what the powerful want. Powerful want a clear distinction. I'm powerful, I do what I want, you're not. You listen to me. Those who are righteous have some amount of power in some way that they expend helping. And just like practically, that's not great if you're trying to preserve all your power, right? If you're trying to stay in charge and you see other people helping people, well, that's just not helpful. Machiavelli talks about how you should pit people against each other so that you remain in charge.
So there's what I'm hearing is that there's an aspect of this that could upset a power structure, for sure. Partially because of maybe actually increased unity among people of goodwill. Also, if we're helping needy people, maybe we're not helping the in charge people that would like us to be doing what they want us to be doing. So that could be part of it.
Yeah, I think it exposes a lot of guilt.
Conviction.
Conviction, guilt.
Okay.
It exposes, something we haven't done or have done or caused. It exposes a lot of guilt. People like to keep it covered up.
Lauren Cunningham, the founder of Youth of the Mission, recently died. He had a wonderful teaching about when you're doing spiritual work, come into the opposite spirit of the place, that there was a kind of a spiritual stronghold in a place. And he said, when you are in, like he said, the West, the accumulation of great amounts of power and influence in one person, wealth and whatever, you don't resist that up front. That just puts you in that kind of Marxist place of I'm envious and I want what you've got or whatever. But to come instead on opposite spirit means to not even acknowledging that that's anything except foolish. And you just live a different way. And he said that is a rebuke to going back to the point there, that's a rebuke to the powers and principalities that control the human beings. So your beef is not with them, but with those power and principalities like, I'm not buying it, I'm not colluding with it.
And nobody likes to be rebuked, so they tend to retaliate. That's good. Yes, Richard?
Well, Jesus makes the the first preference where he says, they revile and persecute you and all those sorts of things falsely. And then for my sake, which means that all of this problem is based on the fact that the people realize you're serving the Lord, they are not, and therefore they're going to come up with some way to fake their opposition to you, because you are doing it with Jesus, they aren't. Therefore, anything you're doing, no matter how good it is, how wonderful, how right, how holy, how whatever, they're going to find some way to attack it. Because if it's them, if you're doing it for Jesus and they're not, anything you're doing is something they're going to find some way to attack. We are experiencing that right now, because there are all sorts of people out there who are supporting some very nasty inclinations among a lot of people all over the country. And the people they publicly attack the most are the Christians, who stand up to say anything about it, to come up with any kind of biblical standard. We are the ones being condemned as the hard-thinking, stiff people who won't let these people have their freedom and all that sort of thing. And we're just saying, no, it's a question of good and bad, evil and whatever. Oh, no, I mean, we are facing a horrible public response that's going on all over. This is exactly what Jesus said. They're attacking you because you're doing it for me.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, Amber.
I would say that Christians in the West and in America have done our share of attacking and condemning as well. But I think of people who have been persecuted overseas for Christ, and I think more of those persecuted people rather than like the church in America right now, having seen like, you know, physical persecution and alienation from family members and things like that. It's more, I think, about people who are choosing to follow Jesus even when their entire families, you know, might reject them, or the government has prohibited, you know, worship of Jesus. And so, I mean, that's real persecution, and not that we can't experience persecution here, but I think that we haven't seen full persecution yet. What some of us think is like, oh, the Christians are, you know, really being attacked in the U.S. right now. It doesn't feel like the level of persecution that people experience around the world.
I think you gotta look at the home first, the persecution that goes on even in your own home. Look at the home, and then we go out into the community after that. It just sort of spreads from there into our systems out there. So it also is in a home, emanates out.
Last thing.
So, as I think of why the righteous are persecuted, or why righteousness, if righteousness is living into the biblical story and the worldview, then we have a different end time or tell-off, a different end time vision of what humanity's purpose is, what the point of history is.
Different goals.
Different goals. And that tells a different story than the culture that they were sitting in, with the Romans coming over it. That tells a different story than our current Western culture or an Islamic culture, which all have a different end goal. So there's going to constantly be a conflict if we've chosen to live righteously as Christians into the biblical story and biblical worldview. We're going to have a constant conflict because we have a different outlook.
I want to suggest also, I think all of this is really worth thinking on, and yeah, thank you so much. I want to suggest too that you know, who we help, who we invest in, is an indicator of our allegiances and our values. And when we choose to expend resources, personal resources, whatever, communal resources on the needy that are in view here, yeah, that's prioritizing people that generally a large portion of groups that, a large portion of societies do not prioritize. That's why they're needy. And so when we are like, no, my allegiance is over here, that begins to upset feelings because, you don't, we've already chosen to reject them, and now you're kind of aligning with people that have been rejected. And so you begin to put yourself in what is often considered an out group, if you will. And so you're kind of leaning into a conflict that already exists. So there's questions of allegiances here that are actually going to continue on throughout the Sermon on the Mount. That we're going to come back to this idea as we go. I want you to notice if the condition was persecuted for righteousness' sake. Here, that the blessing is the kingdom. The blessing is the kingdom. This pulls us back to the needy. Remember? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom. So now we're all the way back there again. It's the same exact blessing. So we have a bookend, if you will, of these Beatitudes with the kingdom. So one thing I think we could consider is that everything in between are just ways of talking about the kingdom. Think about this. I want to go back for a second. We long to be respected by the world sometimes. And the world is its own kingdom. And this gets back to the idea of allegiances. Jesus is calling us into his kingdom. And he's saying this is what you will get. But how do we know? How do we know we're being persecuted for righteousness' sake? How do we know that? Instead of just self-righteousness. What do you guys think about that? Yeah, James.
I found that the actual easiest way is to ask. That's not a joke. There have been some times in my life where I've been treated rather terribly, and I want to know, is it because I'm very obviously Jewish? Is it because they know that I'm a Christian? What's up here, right? I ask. Most of the time it actually is because I'm Jewish, but that's beside the point. But there are people who will say, because you're a Christian and I see what the church has done. And I'm like, oh, you know what? So I'm not being persecuted for righteousness' sake. I'm being yelled at and reviled because someone was being a jerk, and I'm connected to them, frankly. And while I may not deserve it, the community definitely does, So, honestly, you can ask. And even when it comes down to when the Romans were during the great persecution under Diocletian, they were very upfront. Because you worship one God, and it's because you give all your money to people who aren't the government, and we think that's weird.
Well, so I think you're onto something there, and I think that here it's not, it's really not complicated, and I'm grateful for that. I think there's a simplicity to this teaching that if we find ourselves being persecuted because we are sharing the kingdom with the poor and the needy and the hurting and the mourning, and that's where our energy and allegiances are being expressed. And that's why we're being persecuted, then we're in a good spot. And we check that with each other within the community of God. Because we can we can deceive ourselves and think that's what we're doing, but really we're in it for some other self-serving purpose. Like sin and pride is subtle, and you can be doing good things for the wrong reasons, and that's not good, And so we need each other for this, but we check in with each other and we return to this teaching, and we internalize this, and we ask for the Lord for help. And that way we'll know. And we're talking about the pure in heart and humility. So I think coming at it in humility is pretty important. So I want to move on here because we're already, I can't believe it, we're already only about 10 minutes left in our time together, and I want to make sure we have some extra time when we get through this stuff. So Jesus. Now, after the beatitude proper, he then doubles down on this idea. is so interesting to me. Jesus now speaks directly and relationally to the disciples. So all of this has been a generalized teaching, right? He doesn't say just merciful Christians, just poor Christians, or just, whatever. These have been universalized teachings for everybody. But now he really speaks directly to the disciples and what they can experience as disciples. And he says, blessed are you, so not just some, but you, when others revile you on my account. So he puts himself in the place. This seems to be a restatement of the last beatitude, and he's putting himself in the place of righteousness in that beatitude. So, at the very least, we're learning, Jesus is very boldly setting himself up as the standard to imitate. And here we are. Now we're fully kind of in this next mode of the Sermon on the Mount, where now Jesus is really calling us into a radical imitation of him. He says then, after this, so blessed are you when others revile you on my account. And the implication is, everything that I've just said, like when you're reviled for doing all this stuff, they're reviling you because of me. I'm teaching you how to do it, and so I know it's me. Asking you to emulate me. He says then, rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. I guess you can think of that as an encouragement. I'm like, wow. When you're really meditating on it, you just heard all this stuff, and the next thing is, so rejoice. So that's hard. An interesting command, if you will, or encouragement there. Jesus promises it's all going to be worth it because the reward is great in heaven. Now, if you are undergoing real persecution, and when I say real persecution, I mean physical, I mean things that really affect your physical reality, that affect your health and well-being, your ability to move in the world. I'm not only talking, there is a real, I don't want to totally downplay kind of, emotional persecution or kind of being made fun of or mocked or whatever. That causes real pain, and that's a real thing. So I'm not trying to lessen that in any way, but I also want us to understand that the persecution that is in view here probably includes that and more.
Pressure, actually.
Yeah. And so, why, if you're in that kind of situation, which is intense, what? We only have a few minutes, so keep your replies short. But what do you think it is that when Jesus says, your reward is great in heaven, I'm assuming he is meaning to encourage us. So what should we have in mind that is actually good enough to make that kind of suffering worth it? Can you think of what that would be?
Yeah. So the mission of God, or the biblical story, appeals to me in the aspect of willing to be persecuted to the end, or so I think, because not only is it a personal salvation, but it's a cosmic salvation. So by living into this story, even if it leads unto death, I am helping to live into the new creation, to expand that to others, so that at the end of the age of mission, when God restores all heavens, earth, and cosmos, more of us are there, including the non-human creation. So the mission of God appeals to me, the persecution.
I've heard the mission of God appeals to you.
Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah.
Thanks for that reminder. Yeah, there's this amazing future outcome that we want to participate in. Right? And I think that's definitely part of this. As I was reflecting on it, I was thinking that, I'm not really sure that they would have thought when Jesus says this about necessarily a future reality, but rather your reward is great in God's spiritual realm where he is right now, where he is administrating his kingdom. So what is that reward? I do think there's kind of a future aspect. We're gonna get that. That's part of that. It's not spelled out for us, so we have to really do some theology. We have to do some thinking. We have to do some imagination. And I think it's what Jesus wants us to do. Yes, Amber?
Well, it just reminds me of the verse. It's one of my favorite verses. That for momentary light affliction is producing in us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison.
Wow.
And that does point to a future eternal weight of glory, but it says is producing, not
Yes.
is will point to, but like momentary light affliction, which I understand persecution isn't necessarily that, but when you're thinking in the broader global missional global cosmos perspective, right? You're thinking, well, this is momentary light affliction, because in the grand scheme of things, it's producing an eternal weight of glory. And so in the moment it's producing, not like, I think that gives you hope in the moment, and maybe that those are the fruits of the Spirit or whatever it's producing in you through that persecution. That also, I think, makes it worth you. It draws you closer into Christ.
All of this, I agree, all this language of the blessings of the kingdom, being sons of God, seeing God, having all of this inheritance, all points to all these things that you're all talking about. When I think about what is in heaven, I think of who is in heaven, ultimately God himself. And I think this is the reward. All of this actually points us towards this union with God. To be one with him, to really know him. And I think it causes me to do some serious soul searching in my imagination as I think about possibilities of more intense persecution in the United States, or if I was in another country, and whether or not I value union with God. If I believe that, really, that's a good enough reward for me. And it reminds me to continue to cultivate my imagination in all these ways that you were just talking about here, to cultivate my imagination for what the goodness of being one with God is like, and what it will be like, and what it is like now. To be thankful, to cultivate gratitude for the ways that I experience, truly experience a encounter with God now. So they persecuted the prophets, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Jesus is saying, look, you guys are in good company. Fear not, you're in good company. Jesus loved the prophets. Not everybody loved the prophets, right? Jesus loved the prophets clearly and saw himself in that same tradition as the Old Testament prophets. And what he's saying here is that you guys are in this same company. So there's a prophetic vocation that we have in the church, which is, if history shows us anything, which guarantees persecution. So this should not be at all a surprise to us when it comes. If we are going to be prophetic, that is, if we are going to be telling the truth about who God is and who people are, even if we do that in the most loving, kind way possible, because of all these things that we've talked about, because it upsets the status quo, because it realigns allegiances and so on, it will provoke hostility and violence. Here's the thing. We touched on this last week. I don't want us to miss it. Who is the they who persecuted the prophets? Governments definitely did. Like, kings of Israel did not like the prophets. Also the people, though. Also just the generalized people were not always a huge fan, because they weren't telling them what they wanted to hear.
And they were weird.
And the prophets were weird. Yes.
For sure.
We should be a little more weird, maybe.
I don't want to know.
I already got that covered. We're good.
When I was doing my book, I read a lot in Maximus the Confessor, and it always profoundly moved me that it was the church that ripped out his tongue for speaking things they didn't understand. They called him a saint after he died.
Yeah. So, will we receive persecution from governments and anti-Christian governments and all that kind of stuff? Yes. We know this has happened in history. It happens now. It's happening now. If we are living into this vocation as Christians, will we also be persecuted by the church? Yes. We absolutely will. It doesn't mean we don't love the church, and it also doesn't mean that we don't. It also doesn't mean that we then leave the church. Christ was persecuted by his own people and the Romans, and he stayed. He loved them to the end, and loves them even now, and comes to them even now in us. And so that's such a hard thing. And so I hope it's not too kind of a Debbie Downer, you know. But it is a truth that is often glossed over, and I don't want any of you to be taken by surprise when you start living in these ways, or are living in these ways seriously, and you come up on some resistance from people that you thought, wait a second, I thought we were on the same page here. Might not be. I don't want you to be surprised by that. Okay, I'm going to sum up, and then we're going to close with a song. What disciples need to know in the Beatitudes. Remember, this is what he's doing. He's given us what the disciples need to know. Basically this, that Jesus saves. That Jesus saves. God saves through Jesus. There's blessings on the needy. There's blessings for the helpers. There's blessings for the hurting. God comes to meet all of those people with himself, and that is enough. And that is the absolute foundation of discipleship, of walking in the way of wisdom and life. So before everything, God blesses the needy. The present is hard, but it's hopeful. And the future is bright.
How bright is it?
Very.
Interesting.
So the foundation has been laid now for the life of discipleship. What we need to know in order to move forward in following Christ. So now Jesus begins to teach on the role of disciples in the broader world. And so I don't have a date yet, but that is what we are going to be talking about the first time we meet in 2024, maybe in January. We talk about that famous passage about being salt and light. We'll talk about that.